Hi everyone, welcome to another very exciting tutorial. Today is a special one. I'm going to show you how you can create a performant custom cursor. It adds a lot to the visual effects of your website. So for example, in this example that I built a couple of days ago, when I enter this box, you can see how the cursor actually changes to this custom cursor. So you don't see the cursor anymore, and then you see this effect. So basically this is, for example, good if you have an image that the user can click and enlarge. So when you enter on it, then you can have this, for example, with a magnifier icon inside of it. Or in this case, I was just trying to make, like, let's imagine this is a carousel where you can go left and right using this. So if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please go ahead and do. All this effort I put will actually need your help and understanding as well. But without further ado, let's get started. Today I'm going to show you how you can create a custom cursor. So I'm going to codity.netlify.app. Let's go with the HTML first. So I'm going to create a cursor ID because there's only one cursor in the page. I'm going to style it a little bit. So let's do cursor here. And then it needs to be position fixed. Let's put top 0, left 0. I'm going to define a CSS variable called size, and I'm going to tell you why I'm using it. So width is going to be var size. Same goes with the height. So height as well here. And then I'm going to put a border radius of 50%. I want it to be rounded, and then border maybe 3 pixels solid, and then black color. So now you can see this is going to be our custom cursor, but really you can basically put anything inside this, like any image or whatever, and that would become your cursor. And then I'm going to do, because we need to move this custom, let's say, cursor to the position that the mouse ends up every time you move the mouse. So I'm going to use transform, translate. So for x-axis, I'm going to define a CSS variable called cursor x. And then for the y-axis, I'm going to set it to cursor y. And these two variables are the ones that I'm going to control in my JavaScript to set the position of this custom cursor based on this position of the cursor, the real cursor. So now here I'm going to do a different thing here. I'm going to create a class called cursor. Just make sure that when you define a class, it should be starting with a capital letter. So in the constructor, so whenever I create an object of this class, and the way you do this, you do new cursor. So this is how you instantiate an object so that this whole thing starts working. But for now, let's remove it. So the constructor, I'm going to define a target position. So x 0.5 and y 0.5, and I'm going to tell you why I said it. It could be anything really at this point. And then the same goes for the cursor position. So this target is where the mouse cursor is. And then this cursor is, when it moves towards that, that's the position of the cursor at any given time, right? So now I create a onMouseMove method in my cursor class, and then here I basically need to get the cursor position. So I'm going to do this.target.x equals to e.clientx, and then the same goes with client with the client y. So that's the target, wherever the mouse position is at any given time, right? I'm going to divide these. I want to normalize these two values between 0 and 1. It's just easier. So now I'm going to divide this by window.innerWidth, and then this one by window.innerHeight, right? Now I have the values. Then I'm going to create a new method in my class called render, and I'm just going to call it every time I move the cursor. So now I'm just going to set the cursor X to the target X, and then cursor Y to this dot target Y, right? You might want to say, like, why don't you just, you have the target X here, why don't you just set these two values, the cursor X and cursor Y, to these values? And I'm going to show you why. So now I have these two values. I can do this document. I want to set those two variables, right? Then I can do this, the document element style set property, and then I do cursor X, and then variables in CSS starts with dash dash, and then this will be my cursor X, and then same goes for cursor Y. So cursor Y, and then I'll do cursor Y. So now there are two things we need to notice here. First, this mouse move, we need to have a event listener. So I'm just going to create a new method here in it, and I'm going to say window.add event listener move, and then I pass this dot on mouse move, right? But you need to remember, we use this. This refers to this the object that gets created, right? But unfortunately, when you do add event listener, you don't have access to this anymore. So to be able to have that, you need to actually do this. So you have to do this on mouse move, and then you bind this to it. And since the render function is called within this, we have to do the same thing for the render. So I'm just going to do the same thing here. So now let's see how we can make it work. So let's create a cursor object out of this class. You'll see that if I move my mouse, nothing happens. The reason is that I normalized it to 0 and 1. So in my CSS, what I need to do is multiply it with the same values. So I can do calc, then 100 VW, so viewport width, multiply by this, and then I do the same thing for the y-axis. So 100 VH, viewport height, multiply by cursor Y, right? Just to double check everything is fine. So this is the first calc, this is the second calc, and yes, it should be fine. So coming back here, let's see if I made anything by mistake. No, everything looks fine. All right, so now the only thing we need to do is call this init method that we created on the constructor. And obviously it should be this.init because we are referring to the method. And then let's see, window.add event listener, that's all good. We bound the mouse, everything is fine. This.cursor, cursor Y, cursor X, cursor Y, and everything should be working here. And you can see it doesn't work. Let's just debug this. Console.log this.target. I want to see if the mouse event gets fired, so you can see that it actually does not. I need to see these values actually working down here when I move my mouse. And that doesn't work. Let's see what mistake I made. Window, yes, this should be mouse move. The event is called mouse move. So now you can see that when I move my mouse, it actually follows my mouse, right? So I'm just going to remove this console log that we put for the debugging purposes. I'm just going to close this. So now you can see that, but it's not exactly, I want the cursor, the actual cursor be in the middle of that circle. And that's why we define the size here, because what we can do is we can subtract the size divided by 2 from both X and Y, right? So this will be the calc minus var size divided by 2. So now you can see that the cursor is right in the middle. And this is like, if you really just want to have a custom cursor without any visual effects, just following your cursor as it goes, you can just set in your CSS to be able to hide the actual cursor. You can do HTML and HTML star, and then you just put the cursor to be none, right? If you do that, you see you only see the circle here. Nothing special. And that's how you create a custom cursor without any visual effect. It's actually quite nice, but it doesn't have any cool easing effect when you move towards it. Let me just comment this out so that we actually see the cursor. Now we want to create some easing. So there is a function called lerp, which stands for linear interpolation. Let me just paste it here on top of our class. So what it does, it gets 3 parameters. First one is the first position, B is the second position, and N is like a factor, like time or speed or anything that you wanted. What it really does is that when you give it these 2 values with this factor, it generates, right, based on this value, it interpolates between these 2 values. So basically it generates a value in between these 2, starting from this and ending to this. So it starts with this every time it gets called, and it then ultimately it gets to this. So in order to use this, we need to here in the render function, instead of putting it directly, I can use the lerp function, right? So I can do lerp, and I want it to be from the current position of my custom cursor ending up to the position of the actual cursor. And then I'm going to define a property here called speed. It should be between 0 and 1. So 0.2 maybe. And then here I do this dot speed, right? I do the same thing for the y. So this dot cursor dot y to this dot target dot y, and then this dot speed, right? So you can see that it sort of follows, but it also has this nice, it doesn't jump to it. There is like a little bit of an animation, but it's not so nice. You see, it's not exactly smooth animation, but you can see that the lerp function is actually working. Now, how do you make it, but why is it not so smooth? And how can you make it actually being smooth? So the problem is when you do the mouse move every time, it fires a lot of events. So the renderer of the browser actually needs to catch up with it. So it becomes a little bit jaggy, right? It's not as smooth as you can think of. So I can change this to speed to 1 to make it a little bit slower. And you can see it just is jaggy. It actually tries to reach out, but it doesn't really, but it actually tries to. In order to do that, we need to use a JavaScript API called request animation frame, right? So the way to do that is whenever we do the render, instead of doing this, I'm just going to create request animation frame, and then I passed my render function. I put it in a variable called thisRef, or a property called thisRef, because we want to make sure that this doesn't get run when the custom cursor reaches to the ultimate position, which is the actual cursor. And then we do this, and then also for this to work, we have to actually call it again within the render function at the end of it. So I can do this.ref equals to request animation frame this.render, right? So now you can see that nothing happens really. The reason is whenever you mouse move, you actually put this, again, you create a new request animation frame, right? So what happens when you first mouse move, it creates this, and then it just goes on the render function, right? But we have to check here, because if we already have this, we don't want to run it. So not of this. So whenever there is no ref variable, then you see how nice it actually works now. So now I can just change the speed to, you see it's a bit faster. If I set it completely 1, you can see that it's actually much faster. Sorry, like I meant 1, actual 1. You see it actually is like sticking to the mouse, and I can do maybe 0.5, and you can see it's even slower. And that's how you can create this nice animation. But there is a problem with this, right? I told you, when you reach out the cursor positions, the custom cursor's position reaches out to the actual cursor, you don't want this request animation frame to run, but in this way it just runs all the time. To be able to not run all the time, we just need to make sure that the moment your custom cursor gets really close, really close to the actual cursor, and you haven't moved your mouse, you don't want this request animation frame to run. And this is a little bit of a math, so let me just add a little bit of space here. So here, when you set the values, you need to find out the delta between the position of the custom cursor and the actual cursor. And this is a math function, so you do math.sqrt math.power, so the power of this.target.x minus this.cursor.x, the power of 2, plus the same thing on the y-axis, right? So now I just check if delta is less than 0.0001, meaning that these are really close together. I want to cancel the animation frame, and this is the render here. And then I also want to set the this.raf to be null, so no reference to it, and I want to return, right? So now this is much more performant, because if you have this now, it actually will cancel the running of this requesting animation frame when the cursor, the custom cursor, gets really close to the actual position. So imagine you have a page that you have a lot of effects going on. This really adds, because you want to make sure that your page is actually really fast. And now you have this very cool animation. You can go ahead in your CSS and uncomment these so that you don't even see your actual cursor. But you want to make sure that you use it really with cautious, because you know you don't want to run it just because. It needs to add to the value of the experience of the user to your page, right? So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I was really excited about this tutorial. Please subscribe to the channel and like this if you enjoyed this tutorial, and I'm gonna see you next time. There are so many nice things that I'm working on right now with my team, and you will see it's gonna be super awesome. Please subscribe to the channel, and I wish you the best day and night. Goodbye.